1.5 million Americans fall ill each year as a result of the waterborne parasites, the viruses, the bacteria.
That was a study that was done that tried to estimate how many people become ill.
20 million people.
I mean, and when you think about it, most of us who do get sick, we probably don't realize it, right? You go out, you have an upset stomach for a couple days, and you say, oh, I must have eaten something bad the other night, and you don't even think about your water because we don't assume that water contains bad things in America. And for most of us, it's just a couple of days inconvenience. But for some populations, the elderly, the young, people with diseases, or people with immune problems, these diseases, this exposure can be enormously dangerous. And over a lifetime, as you're exposed to other things, to arsenic, to carcinogens that are in water, they end up impacting our health in ways that we probably don't understand.
And what were, from what you can tell, the efforts of the Bush administration over the past 8 years to deal with some of these problems, as I'm sure EPA scientists and other government scientists were discovering the spread of the problem?
The Bush administration was notably inactive on environmental issues. Now, I will say the reductions in enforcement of the Clean Water Act started under the Clinton administration. So this isn't a purely Democrat versus Republican issue. That being said, and this has been fairly well documented by my colleagues in other papers as well as at the New York Times, the EPA under the Bush administration was notably inactive on enforcing a lot of environmental regulations. Lisa Jackson, the new head of the EPA, has said that reversing this is a huge priority for her. And so we're seeing a lot more science-based standards coming into the agency. But the problem is that, it takes a long time to build up a robust system. I mean, it's like, building a newspaper or building a company. It takes a long time to build it up. You can destroy it in just a couple of years. And so we're probably a couple of years away from really having the powerful regulation that the Clean Water Act depends on to survive.
Finally, Charles Duhigg, you've done this series of pieces. Summarize again. You were on for the first pieces, but summarize the trajectory you've taken each of these pieces and what you've looked at of the nation's water.
We started by looking at a chemical named atrazine, which is a pesticide that is the most prevalent pesticide in American waters, and basically looked at whether the EPA was regulating this strongly enough. There's a lot of new science that says that even at very small doses, this can cause, atrazine is related to or seems somehow connected to birth defects. And so the basic question there was, is the scientific system at the EPA working? And some people suggest no. Then we looked at the Clean Water Act and whether it's being enforced, and we found that the Clean Water Act is being violated hundreds of thousands of times every year, and that those aren't being punished. And so as a result, the law doesn't have any teeth. Then we started looking at the biggest sources of pollution. We looked at farms and power plants, which we've discussed. We're going to be doing a piece on sewer overflows, which is a huge source of water pollution. And then finally, later this year, we'll look at the Safe Drinking Water Act and issues around that law and whether it's working. And we're just going through the data now, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that in the last 10 or 15 years, the world has been transformed in terms of the chemicals that we can now use and that we have at our disposal, in terms of how dangerous they are at very, very small concentrations, and that these laws that were created in the 1970s have not been updated to deal with these new threats.
And in fact, I recall when I did a lot of research on the toxic toxic releases as a result of the World Trade Center collapse, there's thousands and thousands of chemicals for which there are no safety limits that the federal government has.
That's exactly right.
A very few number of them that are actually regulated in that sense.
That's absolutely right. And what's interesting is that we have lived through the greatest chemical revolution in the history of the world, right? I mean, we've really solved, and this has been wonderful in many, many ways. We've solved how to create new chemicals and have used that power to really improve the world. But chemicals are dangerous things, and the more complex the chemical, the more dangerous it is at smaller and smaller concentrations. So a lot of these laws, a lot of these protections that were created in the 1970s that dealt with arsenic or barium or things that we knew were dangerous and have existed for thousands of years or since the world began, those laws were designed for those chemicals. And they weren't designed for these new things that are emerging. So as a result, the EPA system, which is called TSCA, for analyzing new chemicals and analyzing the threats they represent, is completely broken. The GAO has said that it's broken. Congress has said it's broken. Lisa Jackson has said that it's broken. They're trying to redesign that system. But there are thousands and thousands of chemicals that essentially the government has never analyzed, which are part of our daily life and a part of our daily environment.
And the power of the lobbyists, I go back to because we see it with the health insurance industry now. We see it operating overtime and overdrive in Washington, D.C. In 2000, they had a tremendous effect when the Bush administration was going to issue stricter controls. Their lobbying efforts gutted that, scuttled that. What makes you think the same won't happen now?
Well, I think what's happening now is there's been a lot of meetings, and you know, no industry wants more regulation. It just creates more cost, right? I mean, I think anyone who works in any industry thinks, oh, we do a pretty good job. We don't need the government coming in. So it's understandable that every industry would fight back against regulation. What's happened in the last year, and part of this is just President Obama has been elected. They see the writing on the wall, and they know they have to change. But also a realization on the part of industry itself that there has to be a cop at the table, is that the chemical manufacturers and the industry has actually sat down with a number of the environmental groups to say, we need a more rational system here. So I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that we're going to see reform, in part because the EPA has said reform's coming whether you want it or not, but in part because the chemical industry has said, we either have to get on the bus or we're going to be left behind. And there seem to be a lot of good faith efforts on their part to come up with a system. Now, obviously they want to influence, right? You want to have a seat at the table because otherwise you don't get to say what the outcome looks like. But the environmentalists that I respect, that I speak to, say that they have these conversations and they think that there is a real dialogue happening.
Well, we want to thank you for being with us. And as you head back to the Times, how is the mood there? With 100 people about to be
it's you know, it's
the newsroom. How many do you have in the newsroom?
I think we have almost over 1,200, I believe.
And 100 are going to be axed by
100
December.
are going to be either voluntarily take a buyout. You know, it's this project that we've done, and we've spoken about this before, we spent 10 months building a database, and there were probably 7 or 8 people involved in it. And
more extensive than the EPA.
More extensive than the EPA. And one of the things that readers said that was really encouraging is they said, thank goodness the Times is doing this type of work, it's expensive. We're living in this new world, and we're trying to figure out how the newspaper can be economically viable in this new world. For anyone who's watching who thinks that what the Times does is important, it's important to, we don't do a very good job of saying buy a subscription, but if you buy a subscription, you're supporting the Times or the Journal or Democracy Now! Or anything. You have to economically support the media institutions that you believe in. And what we're seeing right now is that if people forget to support those institutions, we have to fire journalists.
And the reality is that there are virtually no media companies left in America that could spare 7 people to work for months and months on one project to be able to come up with a story.
I mean, it used to be, every major city used to have a newspaper that did genuine investigative reporting. Now there's 2 or 3 newspapers in this nation that really do it. And you don't know the stories you don't see, right? Nobody wakes up and says, oh gosh, there was an important story on water, but nobody wrote it. It's very important that people support. We're so used to, at this point, getting our media for free over the internet and saying that it's such a wonderful world that we don't have to pay for the news. But when you don't pay for the news, people suffer, or the journalists suffer. And I know that public radio is dealing with this, you guys are dealing with this, we're dealing with this. If readers and viewers believe in media, buy a subscription, send in donations.
And thanks also for helping to explain why people regularly now, every week, are being arrested throughout places like states like West Virginia, being arrested protesting, for example, mountaintop removal, coal power plants, etc.
Yeah, and there's no one to cover it.
Charles Duhigg, we want to thank you for being with us, award-winning reporter for the New York Times, the author of the new series about the worsening pollution in American waters. It's called Toxic Waters. This is Democracy Now! When we come back,